What are your plans for the housing bill, Mr. President?
I don't know. I think it's so unimportant by compared to the Save America Act. Here's what I would like to say. Much more than a bill, that big deal. It's a yawn. Some people say it's wonderful. To me, compared to the Save America Act, just about everything is a big yawn.
You and your pain about the cost of rent and the dream of buying a house are a, quote, big yawn to me. It is almost like Donald Trump is trying to suck at being president and winning the midterms. It is like he is trying to make ads for Democratic candidates' midterm campaigns. His apathy, his indifference, his lack of impulse control to say what he really thinks, which is obviously that the basic economic struggles of everyday Americans, including the millions who voted for him, are a, quote, yawn. It is why we are seeing his poll numbers plunge to levels that were simply unimaginable 2 years ago, particularly in deep red conservative parts of Texas, the state Trump won by 14 points. A brand new New York Times Siena poll shows Texas State Representative James Tallarico tied with that state's Republican candidate, the Attorney General Ken Paxton, at 47% apiece. The poll highlights how in Texas, just 44% of voters approve of the job Donald Trump is doing as president, with 53% of respondents in Texas saying they disapprove of Donald Trump. I want to bring into our conversation Democratic pollster, political analyst Cornell Belcher. Tim is still here. Cornell, where's your head these days on the state of the Democrats' fortunes in Texas?
Here we go with Texas again, Nicole? Here we go.
I know. I was a Beto believer. I have Texas. I have Texas. I feel like I spent a lot of time in Texas, and what the Texas Republicans like is not what Donald Trump is doing. Gold-gilded stuff does not sell with the sort of like the alpha conservative brand in Texas.
I think that's right. Because look, I think it's the opening is that Trump's job approval is way underwater in Texas, which is a long time since you've seen a Republican president this far underwater in Texas. And look, to show you, and look, I was on this show, on your show back when the primary was just before the primary was happening. And I said, look, if Paxton takes out Cornyn, this becomes an open seat. And if Texas becomes an open seat, like all of us political hacks on this panel understand, that's different than an incumbent. And I think that becomes a much more competitive race, and Republicans are going to have to spend money there. And so what you have right now is a toss-up race. But for just curb our enthusiasm for a moment here, it's a toss-up race where Paxton, who has been indicted, has allegations of cheating, has been impeached, and is an election denier, is in a toss-up race. It is a toss-up race where Paxton, who is seen by a majority as not having good ethics, and where Tallarico, by 18 or 13 points, seen as the more moral, upstanding person and the person with the right values, is in a toss-up in Texas. That's how tough Texas is. However, I think this time there is a shot because you do see independents breaking for the Democrat there in a way where we've also seen, Nicole, in the special elections that we've seen, as well as the statewide elections in the off year we've seen independents breaking away from Republicans at such a staggering number that it puts a lot of these districts, a lot of these places in play. The other thing I would point out about the polling really quickly is that there was a lot of conversations about the ground that Republicans made and Donald Trump made among Hispanics, Latinos in the last presidential election. If you look at the way Tallarico is running up the score with Hispanics in Texas right now, you understand that that was not solid, or certainly not a shift that we've seen permanence to, as they are also moving back to Democrats.
Yeah, and we saw that in New Jersey. It was just a question of whether that was a New Jersey development or a national trend. Cornell, let me ask you about the economy. Is it? I mean, because you made the point more clearly than I could have. I mean, on the question of ethics or morals, you've got Paxton's own wife answering those questions for us, that he is not moral, he is not ethical. If you take that away as perhaps not a top tier issue, is it the economy, or what is sort of the issue set look like for you?
Well, if you look at the data, we always want to make it about the economy because quite frankly, we're kind of lazy and it's an easy story. But it's never simply about the economy, right? Voters are making sense of their lives through the prism of their values, of their religiosity, through a lot of different things. But the economy is always central. And look, here's one where again you see independents really moving away from Donald Trump and Republicans on handling the economy. Nicole, if Donald Trump were not underwater by such a large percentage point in Texas, this would not be a tie race, right? Here is one where you absolutely see Donald Trump is the problem dragging down the Republican brand, because everywhere you see where Donald Trump is underwater, the vast majority of voters who are disapproving of Donald Trump are breaking for the Democrats. So the more he goes underwater, the better it is for Democrats. And here's a state where you see that fade. Like, this would not be that competitive of a race if Donald Trump was not such a drag on the ticket.
So, Tim, this is what the New York Times poll finds about this question of the economy. Jobs, the stock market, inflation, and the cost of living are by far the most pressing issue for Texas voters. 28% said economic issues would decide their vote, triple any other issue, and a full 60% of voters disapprove of Trump's handling of cost of living issues. It's sort of, again, I wasn't not a pollster, I'm not an expert, but from working on campaigns, those are just numbers that are becoming structural. And they actually kind of explain why for Trump policy meetings are a quote yawn. He needs his election rigging bill to pass because on the policies he's given up.
Correct. Yes. And I think that there's maybe positive ways to look at that. That's, I think, going to be good for the Democrats. In elections, there's some negative ways to look at it, which is what's happening in his head if he doesn't care about elections anymore. But, on the Texas election, just kind of to add to what you and Cornell said, as part of my personal journey, I know that people like an update. After the trauma of 2024, Cornell had to get back to work doing pollstering. I quit looking at polls for a while because I just couldn't do it. It was too much PTSD, but I'm back, baby. I'm back. This poll came out this morning. I was digging into the crosstabs.
Me too.
I'm ready to get back out in the field. And I was looking at it, and look, I mean, it's interesting. The recall vote for the election in this poll was Trump plus 10. So, that's a 1 in 10 Texas voters have moved, from voting, saying that they're no for Trump to saying that they would vote for Tellerico, give or take. And so that's a meaningful difference. It's the Hispanic voters, almost, the majority of them, as Cornell pointed out. It's also some older whites, which I think we can probably shorthand as old George W. Bush types in Texas. And so those are the two groups that have flipped, where Tellerico is still getting just crushed, where Democrats have gotten crushed for a while now, is with working class white voters. And Tellerico is winning basically every other demographic except for working class white voters. He's losing by 40. And so that's the question, is how can the Democrats now over the next 4 months try to narrow that gap by talking about affordability, by demonstrating they care about affordability, by contrasting from Trump, who doesn't care about affordability, who only cares about the gold ballroom, and said that it was a yawn when people were concerned about housing. So some of those voters obviously aren't gettable, but I just think that is where the fight is. Is can you reach a breaking point with some percentage of working class whites in order to win in some of these red states? Because that's kind of the last holdout.